Good morning to our US-based attendees and good afternoon to our attendees following this program from Europe. We are delighted to welcome you all for this webinar titled Caught in the Crossfire, What Businesses Need to Know About US-EU Tariffs. And thank you so much to Greenberg Traurig, a President Circle member, for hosting today's program. My name is Christina Slezinska. I am the Executive Director of EACC Florida, the Florida chapter of the European American Chamber of Commerce. Our mission is to create business opportunities for member companies and their executives by connecting them to our transatlantic network and by offering resources, education, and updates on regulatory and legal developments of relevance to the transatlantic business community in Florida and, of course, across our network of EACC chapters. Back in 2020 and 2021, EACC Florida held a couple of programs which discussed trade disputes, tariffs, and their impact on steel, bags and wine, Harley-Davidson, Scotch whiskey, and more. Fast forward to 2025, we're back into the same, but possibly much deeper and with less clarity. Today's program, therefore, perfectly illustrates our mission of offering timely updates on burning issues, as well as practical strategies and tips to navigate the current tariff-related uncertainty, mitigate exposure, and maintain resilience. We would like to thank all of you who provided questions when they registered, some of which were used to shape this program. In a volatile trade environment, knowledge and preparation are your best defense, which is why I'm delighted to briefly introduce our stellar cast of experts drawn from EACC Florida's member companies. Jody Ader is Senior Manager, Trade and Tariff Advisory Services at RSM US and has more than 25 years of experience in working in international trade. Her expertise lies in import, export control, and sanctions matters with a focus on trade risk assessment, tariff reduction planning, policy and procedures development, and training programs. Jody joins us from the RSM US offices in Boca Raton. Jose Mallea is the managing partner of Forward Global Miami, an international firm headquartered in Paris, which focuses on risk management for executives, businesses, and institutions. Jose focuses on addressing complex, high-stakes matters for Latin American and US clients across industries and issue areas. Jose has also served various politicians and elected officials in various capacities at local, state, and federal level, and is also the founder of a small business, the Biscayne Bay Brewing Company in Miami. Jose joins us from their brand new offices in Miami. Laura Rabinowitz is a shareholder at Greenberg Traurig and a frequent speaker at EACC. She counsels domestic and multinational businesses on complex supply chain issues and other challenges associated with trade, advising on mitigation of duty exposure and compliance. Her focus is on industries such as renewable energy, steel, apparel, consumer products, and industrial equipment. Laura joins us from Greenberg Traurig's offices in New York. And last, but certainly not least, Alan Sutton is a principal shareholder at Greenberg Traurig. He is an experienced business lawyer with a principal focus on commercial transactions with intellectual property and technology issues and privacy and cybersecurity matters. Beyond his area of principal expertise, Alan is also EACC Florida's first president. He's our host at Greenberg Traurig, and he's our moderator for the day. And we're very happy to have him with us today because it is also his birthday. And before I give the floor to Alan, some housekeeping notes. If you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A box, and our panelists will try to address them in the course of the program. Please note that the program will be recorded and made available on EACC Florida's YouTube channel. Also, the views expressed by our speakers are their own. They do not necessarily reflect those of EACC Florida or our members and do not represent legal advice. So now, Alan, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christina, and welcome everybody to this webinar. We have a significant group of participants today, both in the United States and in Europe, and we hope that by the time we finish this webinar, we will leave you with not only perhaps a little more understanding of what's going on, but some practical tips to dealing with this somewhat chaotic situation that we're all going through at the moment. We are in an unprecedented time, really. And with respect to the issue of today, the tariff situation, the positions of the U.S. government in particular seem to change almost daily. So I think perhaps the place to start today is by asking the question, as we sit here today on April 29th, 2025, what is the current situation with respect to tariffs imposed by the U.S. and any tariffs imposed by our major trading partners? Laura, you want to
Sure.
start the discussion?
Welcome, everyone. So you'd have to be living under a rock not to realize that there's been a tsunami of tariffs imposed by the Trump administration since the beginning of February. And they've been rolled out country specific and sector specific. So they started with an additional 20% on all goods coming from China. That was at the beginning of February due to the fentanyl crisis, the reason stated in the executive order. And this, of course, and I'm just going to say in terms of where we are today, any tariffs on products of China is on top of the tariffs that the Trump administration imposed in their first administration, which the Biden administration kept in place and are currently in place. So that it's about 2/3 of the products coming from China carry an additional 25% or a smaller list at 7.5%. And then in February, there's an additional 20%. And then the administration has also imposed 25% on goods of Canada or Mexico, except goods that qualify under our free trade agreement under USMCA. Steel and aluminum products also carry an additional 25% tariffs, and it's steel and aluminum, but it's the list of derivative products where companies have to be careful. And as we were talking earlier, you're either on the list or you're not on the list. So it's not 100% of steel and aluminum coming in, but they have specific lists. And if so, there's an additional 25%. And then autos and auto parts carry an additional 25%. That went into effect April 3rd for autos. And then the parts are to start later this week on May 3rd. But according to the Wall Street Journal last night, that could be amended today. So we'll see. We're waiting on the auto announcement. And then on April 2nd was the big rollout of universal tariffs. And it started with country-specific provisions and then quickly changed to a universal 10% additional tariffs on 100% of the goods coming from every country, with the exception of China, which got an additional 125%. So that's sort of where we are today. It's a lot, and it's complicated to figure out the valuation of goods coming into the US.
It's complicated and changing very rapidly. It could be different by the end of this webinar. You never know.
I expect an auto announcement while we're speaking.
And to that point, Jose, you do a lot of work on the sort of what I would call the government affairs side.
Yeah.
You know, maybe you can help us understand what's the long-term goal of the Trump administration and maybe who some of the key players are in the administration.
Yeah, definitely.
Driving
Thank you,
this
Alan,
process.
for moderating, and it's great to be here with you guys. I think this is a really important webinar that's taking place, and I'm glad that we're recording it so it can be shared later, because I'm sure a lot of folks will want to look to it. And to Laura's point, the information might be outdated by the time we finish the webinar, but we'll try our best here. To answer that question, Alan, I think we kind of have to go back to the early days of President Trump's candidacy, right? Going back to 2015, 2016, when he themed his entire campaign on the message, which has become quote unquote a movement of his base, this "Make America Great," followed by this "America First" notion, right? And they created even a policy think tank called America First Policy Institute, that even between the time President Trump left office in his first term to now, continued to write papers and have folks out there who were talking about this issue. He's made it in several campaign speeches and other events, and throughout his first administration, he talked about how he felt America was being ripped off, was being taken advantage of. and his intention was to use tariffs as a tool to level the playing field, right? When it came to trade. I think over the next 4 years while he was out of office, a lot of that thinking evolved. And it became more than just using it for the leveling of trade. It became a policy tool, or the idea was formed that this will become a policy tool to realign relationships with different countries and to address key national security issues even, right? And so we saw that his first announcement targeted the three biggest trade partners, China, Canada, and Mexico. And the first statement that was made with regards to Canada and Mexico had a lot more to do with the border, the fentanyl crisis, those issues than it did with actual trade. And so since that time period, right after the election, we've been engaged with some of the then campaign and transition officials who are now officially in government to talk about this. And as to who are the influencers, there's a very small group of people at the very top. Everyone talks about Peter Navarro, who's someone that was with him in the first term, served time in prison because he wouldn't answer a subpoena, I believe it was the case, to appear before Congress. Anyway, he's back in the White House, and he is probably one of the most influential people in the space. He's actually also someone that doesn't take a lot of meetings. So we've actually not been able to, I don't think too many people have been able to really directly engage with him. But the other two key people are the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of the Treasury, who have both been very accessible to industry as well as to different nations that have been meeting with them. And then you get into another level of advisors. There's a U.S. Trade Representative, Jameson Greer, and then there are folks who are being confirmed, right? That they're yet to be confirmed at the undersecretary level at some of these agencies. Jeffrey Kessler, Undersecretary at Commerce for, I always botch the name, but for BIS. So I believe it's Bureau of Industry and Security, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, so he's become a key player now. So there's a lot of folks as you move away from the inner circle that are starting to work on this issue. But the way I'd like to describe it with President Trump is very unconventional. I worked in the White House for President Bush, and usually you had a bunch of policy advisors who did a lot of work for many, many months before you got down to a recommendation, and then you made a decision, and that decision went to the president. With President Trump, it's kind of upside down. He makes the decision, and then everyone has to scramble to figure out how it's going to be implemented or what the impacts are. And we're seeing that in the way that that the tariff policy has been rolled out.
And I would just say and Jose, you're absolutely right. In terms of there are additional tariffs coming, and
That's right.
to speak to your point about how things are being rolled out, as I mentioned in the first Trump administration, when they rolled out the tariffs on China, there was a notice and comment period. Companies had a few months to gear up. There was notice of a few months. Now they've put out, and there is an opportunity to comment. It's a very short comment period on copper, timber, lumber, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and critical minerals. It's going to be rolled out the next day, most likely. Or very shortly. The comment period closes May 7th. It's going to be rolled out very quickly. So, I mean, it's 3 weeks from the date of the announcement for the ones that are open right now. So very fast, very fast moving.
Well, it is very fast moving. And one of the things we've seen is that the polls in the last few days suggest that many of his supporters actually are not supporting, his historical supporters do not support these activities. Do you have any thoughts about?
Yeah, definitely. Polling is it's something that definitely matters, although a lot of times elected officials will say, "Oh, we're not going to do this based on what polls say." And the president has kind of made statements like that, hey, we need to be prepared for short-term pain in order to have long-term benefit. And, there was a moment there where he's always trying to find catchphrases that stick. I think when he did the Liberation Day announcement, he said, "Don't be a panicking," kind of like a Republican or Democrat. Don't panic and be hysterical about the situation. But I do think that poll numbers will matter to the president, but more so to the members of Congress, right? They have a very important midterm election cycle coming up, and members of the House are all up in 2 years. There are some very important Senate races that are also going to be up, although the Senate's probably less at risk than, say, the House. But that matters, right? And so I think we have we have to be mindful of that. I think the administration will be mindful of that. I still think they feel like they have a lot of runway before that becomes a critical decision or has an impact that can be turned around. But it's definitely something to keep an eye on. And you're right. I think some of the polling, I believe it was a New York Times poll, had the second lowest or the lowest first 100 days metrics, second only to his first term, right? So I think that's something that they're definitely going to be sensitive to. And by the way, they also do their own internal polling, right? They have a lot of their own internal polling that they're doing. And all the committees on the congressional side and on the Senate side, they also do their internal polling. So people kind of have a little bit more insight into this than we like to think.
Well, maybe we can get the panel's thoughts on what the likely long-term impact of the current policy is going to have and all these tariffs are going to have, because it seems, in some respects, it's driving countries in a direction that maybe wasn't anticipated, that maybe it will drive people to organize around the US as opposed to deal with this. I don't know, what's the panel's view on what some of the long-term impacts of these tariffs will be?
I could start maybe. So it seems a lot of our traditional trading partners are upset with us. Traditionally, they've thought of us as a stable place. They kind of knew what they got and could conduct business in a way. And now a lot of countries are rethinking, right? We might even see retaliatory tariffs from other countries. We've already seen the surtax in Canada, right? What's going to go on with the US-Canada relations? I know this is a European focused webcast, but there could be similar things going on in Europe too, right? You just don't know, but it could very well shift America's perception in the global economy, really.
And that,
Yeah.
and that would, exactly as Jody said, that would impact if America's, perception, but also financial reality, if it costs more to send US made goods anywhere in the world, US exports could certainly decline.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, and
go ahead.
that's right. I think also we did see some responses, sometimes you could say they're knee-jerk reactions or just, immediate reaction to some of these tariffs. And I believe that the EU Commission president had indicated every option is on the table. They announced their own set of retaliatory tariffs April 9th, right, against some of the 232 tariffs, which was then suspended after President Trump announced the 90-day pause on April 10th. So, and I think that was a really significant escalation, I think, to the point that Jody and Laura are making. I mean, that is a critical damaging impact, both ways, right? But that starts to really hurt U.S. exporters. And I think that is something that the administration was sensitive to. And so were a lot of members of Congress. So kind of going back to this notion that even though Congress doesn't have official authority over a lot of these issues directly on most of them, the president has a lot of, leeway through IEPA and other tools that he's using. But it is something that they're very sensitive to. And that reaction does have an impact. I think even though this is a European focused webinar, but I agree Mexico and Canada are both very important pieces to this strategy. And you've seen sort of the reaction from both countries, right? Where Canada had a very strong adverse reaction. I think Mexico has been a little bit more tactful, more strategic, and they've been able to get some, I guess better concessions in some ways, or just some deference on some issues. And the goal there, I think, is to have a negotiated trade agreement, renegotiation of USMCA in the coming months. And we might see some of that happening with some of our partners abroad as well, right? Where this sort of becomes a key point to either expedite, although trade agreements are not as simple as they sound, they take a long time. I think the quickest one ever was Singapore, which took like 18 months, but we might see some of that coming out of this in the short to midterm.
And I would say the time between now and July 9th is crucial Apparently, the administration is they're negotiating with a lot of countries, but they're focused on up to 18 countries. They won't speak about what's in their framework in terms of non-tariff barriers. So it's a lot more complicated than just tariffs. The administration is really focused on the non-tariff barriers, the VAT in Europe, for example, and other charges. So we'll see what happens between now and July 9th, because that will really impact how expensive goods are from every country coming into the US. You know, where is the EU going to land? Is it going to be 10%? Is it going to be 5%? Is it going to be 20%? You know, we'll see.
Well,
I mean, it was so much easier. Life was so simpler in the first Trump administration when all we had was 25% on goods coming from China. So the strategy was anywhere but China. It's a much more complicated and expensive time.
Yeah.
well, other than just sitting back and watching the chaos and trying to make sense of it, is there anything that, and before we turn to mitigating strategies and things that companies can employ, is there anything the private sector can do to try to influence the process? Are we at a point in time where there are things, you know, the private sector can do that may have some influence in how this develops?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in on the political side, and I'm sure you guys have thoughts on the technical side, right? And how they can, you know, prepare their. I mean, I think one of the most important things is quality information. We were actually having a discussion around what's out there available publicly before this webinar started, and it's challenging. And so some of what we try to do from our firm is gather good intelligence as best as we can, and to try to predict what's going to happen and when. You know, we've gotten it right a lot of times, and sometimes not. All right, and that's really hard for companies, but at least it gives them a little bit of insight into what's going on. Those of you that are here in the U.S. that have access to your members of Congress, I would reach out to them, and they're very accessible. People sometimes think that you have to, you know, hire someone to do that for you, and you don't. You can do it yourself. You can go to your local district or DC. And the reason I mention that is because this conversation that we talked about that's taking place between the new Undersecretary of Commerce is happening in the coming weeks with members of Congress on different issues that they're bringing to the table. And I think it's the sort of, you know, give the members a place where they can go and share their worries. Someone who's a very highly respected technical you know, government official who understands the downstream economic impact of some of these decisions. And I think if you can do that, share with them some of your pain points and some of the concerns that you have, because you'd be surprised. Sometimes just a piece of information they gather from one of those meetings can be very helpful in some of those discussions. And I think on a larger scale, you know, working with you know, groups like this one, right? These are associations that represent interests of everyone that's on this call, and these members, and I think these kinds of associations are super important as a part of this this debate and this dialogue that's taking place around these issues. So I would engage. I would do that. I would share your story. I would share your pain points with whoever you can that's in some sort of official capacity. And you know, I'll turn it over to my colleagues here on the call, who I'm sure have some thoughts on some of the challenges as it pertains to supply chain and other issues that companies are dealing with.
And as you address those, just want to raise a practical point for many of our viewers today. This issue of the difficulty in getting reliable information, maybe in your answers, you could also provide whatever guidance we can provide to people to how do you make sense, because there's some misinformation out there. There's no, you know, one good source. So your thoughts on that as you continue would be great. Sorry, Jody, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no, that's okay. What I was going to say was, you know, a lot of companies are panicked, right? The volatility has them kind of flat-footed and frozen. They don't know what to do. And what my best advice I could give to people is, well, there is always change in life, right? You need to prepare. Even if you don't act on certain strategies, just know what's out there, what's available to you. Well, first, of course, really understand what the facts are, because to like my colleague's point, there is a lot of misinformation out there. I mean, I'm getting daily requests from people to clarify how the tariffs are calculated, especially if they have steel articles, and see what you could do. Again, even if you're not acting now, just be prepared so you could
Right.
pivot, be a little bit more agile.
And I find in terms of that agility, the larger companies are able to pivot quicker and have already, they're used to pivoting from, particularly if they're sourcing in China, certain components, either components or finished products, they're used to pivoting from China, from the first Trump administration. COVID also, those companies, they're used to moving where factories were open. But it used to be that to determine value, and Jody was just speaking to how are duties calculated, like, what is the formula? It used to just be, what is the general rate of duty? Unless you're under a free trade agreement where things come in free, all merchandise, and we're part of a worldwide trading system, all merchandise has a code attached to it, a classification code. So it's how is the merchandise classified? And with that, there's a duty rate. And merchandise coming into the US was either, a lot of merchandise comes in duty free, but the rates also go up over 40%. Particularly apparel and consumer products are in the high range, but a lot of merchandise comes in duty free. So that was in our simpler time. Now, it's also based on the value, and companies, like Jody said, they're like hysterical, but they're really focused on how can we reduce the value of our goods, because upon that, the duties are based. So whether there's a blanket 10%, but it's 10% of the value of the goods. So the value of the goods, and then also what is the country of origin of the goods. So right now, everybody has a 10% except Canada, Mexico, and then China. So there's a huge interest in changing the country of origin so it's beneficial from a duty perspective. And that's fairly new, because before, companies were just limited to potentially using a free trade agreement. I mean, I'll give you a recent example with a German company that I worked with. They manufacture refrigeration equipment for restaurants, and the compressor is made in Germany. And then they ship the compressor to China for final assembly. And basically, the final assembly is building a housing around the compressor, and then they export from China to the US. And they were declaring the merchandise as country of origin China, which now, as we know, would increase their costs exponentially. So I said, if we actually look at the product, and custom standard is what is the essential character of the product, and in what country is it substantially transformed. So when we looked at the product, we said the compressor is actually the essential character of the product. Customs agreed with us. And so now it's country of origin Germany, which currently is carrying an additional 10%, not the 145% from China, 145% plus from China. So
that's a great point. Yeah, and I see a lot of other companies too who ship some Chinese origin, like sub-assemblies for, final assembly to Mexico or something. And we're saying, well, maybe you could break things down a little bit differently to, so the sub-assembly is not the essential character of what you're finally making. So you could end up with a more favorable country of origin basis for tariffs as well. Yeah, we're seeing so much. And to your point too, what you mentioned before getting into this country of origin example, customs valuation has been a huge thing. Particularly when you see a lot of companies that are either shipping like an e-commerce sort of model, where maybe the foreign entity acts as an importer of record and title isn't transferring until goods come into the US. So there's flexibility to use a different way to assign a value, an import value to the product. And also like related party transactions. There are so many transatlantic related parties. If looking at transfer pricing, I know there's other tax implications for adjusting transfer pricing, but if there's a way to lower the value in those circumstances, like Laura had mentioned, you start with a lower cost basis that the tariffs get assessed on.
And also there are legal deductions that a company can take from the value that they're declaring to customs, such as international freight is always deductible. So is the freight charge from the foreign port to the foreign, the freight charge from the foreign factory to the foreign port. It's foreign inland freight. That's a legal deduction. So if the US importer is being charged for that cost, if the company can get a line item for that cost, that can be a legal deduction. And also the foreign port charges are also legal deductions from the value that's declared to customs. So, it's not, potentially it's not a lot, it depends on the supply chain and the model. If you're importing if a company is importing just a handful of entries a year, maybe expensive merchandise a handful of times a year, that won't have such an impact. But for companies that have lots and lots of shipments, those foreign inland freight charges, foreign port charges really add up. And of course, the big one is the international freight.
I think this has been a really good transition into a core topic we wanted to get today, which are mitigation strategies. And we're talking about companies that are directly selling goods in or importing goods into the country. So let's maybe we can explore some other potential strategies that those types of companies might use, whether they're things like foreign trade zones or bonded warehouses or other types of strategies that maybe could be employed to mitigate the impact of these tariffs. I don't know who'd like to.
I could start, I guess.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, Alan, great suggestions, bonded warehouses and foreign trade zones. I mean, I love both options. The bonded warehouses quite often are very beneficial, particularly with companies that might use the US as a hub. Maybe they're importing goods from Europe and Asia. They're storing them in the US and then ultimately they're exporting a portion, even if it's only like 5%, right, out to Canada, Mexico, the Caribbean, etc. You could bring goods into this bonded warehouse and not pay tariffs. Ultimately are exported, but of course the goods can stay in bond until they're needed for domestic consumption. And that's when the tariffs would kick in, when you withdraw goods from the warehouse, right? So you're getting a cash flow benefit there by not having to pay the tariff immediately upon import. But we find that they're very beneficial for those companies that have a portion of the goods that are exported, because that's a permanent elimination of the tariffs on those products alone, right? And then you can't do any manufacturing, but you could do some light pick and pack and maybe some quality testing. So you can't use it for everything, right? So foreign trade zone, I like to call a bonded warehouse on steroids. And maybe, I don't know, Laura, if you want about that one?
A foreign trade zone. Yeah, we've seen a huge interest in bonded warehouses in particular because of the duty deferral aspect for the goods so with a bonded warehouse, merchandise is physically in the United States, but it's not in the commerce of the United States. So there's that. For the merchandise going into the US, it's the company's decision when to take the merchandise out of the bonded warehouse and enter the commerce. So then they pay that. They pay, at the company's choice. They have up to 5 years to keep merchandise in a bonded warehouse. Foreign trade zones have the advantage of being able to manufacture in a foreign trade zone, but they've lost a lot of their duty benefits. The Trump administration has taken away a lot of those benefits in their executive orders in terms of foreign trade zones. But the movement, as Jody said, the movement of goods in bond for the percentage of the merchandise going out of the US has really been very, very helpful to companies that weren't taking advantage of it before. So we've seen a huge uptick in interest in bonded warehouses. And there are other duty mitigation strategies I can address. One of which is, it's called first sale. It's a way to structure the transaction, which reduces the value of the goods coming into the US. So instead of, let's say, $10 a unit, we can make it $8 a unit, and then you pay duty on the 8, not the 10. And we've seen this a lot. For the past number, I would say since the first Trump administration, when companies were interested in saving on duties for products manufactured in China. Now, of course, there's global interest. And we see it with European parents who are manufacturing globally and then importing into the US. Tremendous interest. So with first sale, you need 3 parties, a US importer, a middleman outside of the US, and then a factory which actually manufactures the goods. And the idea is you structure it so that you're reducing that factory, you're reducing that middleman profit, administrative expenses. So you have to pay duty on the value of the components and the labor and the factory's profit, but you don't have to pay duty on the value of any of that markup of the middleman. So it really can save 10 to 20% of duty payments. So it's very, very valuable. We've seen a huge interest in first sale since this started.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of requests for that too. The one thing with first sale that's so important is to have that documentation trail that proves that those goods were purchased by the middleman for export to the US. There has to be proper payment records, really structuring things the right way. Even maybe having goods packaged in a way that are destined for the US if there isn't going to be repackaging, if there's US specific requirements. So it is a hard one to prove. You can't just say, oh, because I use a middleman, I can apply first sale. It's very important to do a full-blown analysis to make sure that it could meet customs scrutiny.
Yeah, 100%. Particularly, this is available if the middleman and factory are related parties or unrelated. If they're unrelated, it's much simpler because by definition, they negotiate at arm's length and it would be, the pricing would be acceptable. But if they're related, you really have to ensure that the factory is making a sufficient profit level commensurate with the profit level of the middleman.
Sorry, one of the questions that we've had come in are whether used goods are tariffed at the same rate as new products.
I can answer that. For unrelated parties, and for related parties, but there's an invoice that's submitted to customs, which is the basis of the valuation. If there's a buyer and seller, I should say, if there's not a sale for the goods, then it's a different valuation. But for a buyer and a seller, it's based on the invoice price. So the invoice price for used goods should be less than the invoice price for new goods.
Okay. Coming back to sort of the broader concept of mitigation strategies, maybe we can talk about some others. One that I've heard referenced but don't fully understand are delivered duty paid shipments. Maybe you can explain what that means and continue the discussion of our mitigation strategies.
I don't know that that's necessarily a mitigation strategy. So I work with it. I mean, for an US importer, right, you're kind of you don't need to worry about any of the import compliance responsibilities. You've kind of pushed that onto the shipper. I'm not a big fan of DDP. I mean, it's certainly easy operationally, but I think it could cause a whole host of issues from a compliance perspective. Like, for example, the importer is still ultimately going to be the ultimate consignee and might have some sort of customs obligations, right, from a compliance point of view. And further, taking it a step back is for the shipper, they suddenly have to be familiar enough with US customs requirements to comply with them. And then from a cost standpoint, quite often, right, DDP includes everything, including international freight, which Laura was explaining earlier, can be deducted from the customs value. So you'd have to structure the invoice in a way where you could still back that charge out from the dutiable value. I don't know, what are your thoughts on use of DDP?
Yeah, I've seen it suggested a lot by foreign vendors since this started. And honestly, it's not always for compliance or to help it's not always in a compliant way. And I've seen some nefarious action, which I'm not used to seeing, where vendors are saying, we'll be a non-resident importer, which is permissible under law for foreign vendors to be a non-resident importer, enter the merchandise DDP, which, as Jody said, means they're paying the duties, they're in charge of the import process. But the US buyer is on the documentation which submitted to customs as the consignee, which is where the goods are actually going. So US Customs has no jurisdiction over a non-resident importer. If you're a Chinese company and there's an undervaluation, customs can't go after that country for those extra $2 in duties. But they do have jurisdiction over a US consignee, a US company where the goods are going. And their name, and that US company's name is on the documentation. It's on the invoice also, because that's the sale that causes the importation into the US. But it's being suggested a lot.
Yeah. And I'm seeing too, I work in the food and beverage space a lot, and there's some other sort of requirements. I know this isn't the purpose of the call today, but there's DDP shipments quite often in that industry. But then there are also some FDA requirements, something called a foreign supplier verification program, where the importer or whoever's filing the customs entry has to put a foreign supplier verification responsible party on the customs entry. And quite often they're putting the importer who thinks they have no responsibility because they're buying on a DDP basis. And the next thing you know, they're contacted by the FDA to provide their documents to comply with FSVP. And they're completely confused. And what's even worse about that is when the FDA asks for those documents, they have 24 hours to produce them. So it's causing a lot of problems I see in that sector specifically at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, exactly as you said earlier, the importer gives up control over the importing process. And I had a question earlier this week from a European company. If we have good controls in Europe, why can't we be the US importer? And why can't we be a non-resident importer? Which they can. But we don't always see, actually, in my experience, I have not always seen great controls when the trade compliance person is not physically in the United States. Because US regulations are different than global and then other countries' regulations. In terms of, just for one example, is determining the country of origin. The US has different origin rules than most of the rest of the world. And I've seen some confusion there.
I think many businesses probably find the whole subject very confusing. So I would, it would be interesting to hear what other risk mitigation strategies are, but also maybe some comments about, how do you sort through it? I can tell you as somebody who doesn't do this regularly, just listening to it, it's very confusing to follow all the details. So I have to imagine that while most companies to whom this is relevant, have some experience in this constantly shifting landscape with all these intricacies make it very difficult to figure out which of these various strategies, are best for them. Maybe you could offer some thoughts on, basically what's a business to do? How does it figure out?
supply, like you said, supply chains just got a lot more expensive. So my mantra is that companies really need visibility into their supply chains and understand where their components are coming from. Of course, they have visibility to their tier 1 suppliers, but they need visibility below that, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, understand where all their components are coming from. And then protect themselves in their agreements. Production agreements are negotiated many months before entry into the US. So that's something also that companies really need to understand. I've heard that we signed the agreement 4 months ago, and isn't that my tariff rate? Well, the answer is no, it's date of entry. So you have to protect the companies have to protect themselves in their production agreements to account for the changes as we see this very fluid tariff situation. So
Yeah, I agree. Starting
mantra
with
is
the supply
visibility.
chain. Yeah, starting with that supply chain is key, because if you don't know where you're importing from and where your goods might ultimately end up, like for example, being exported out of the US, it's hard to plan. Once you have your supply chain, you could run through the whole list to say, oh, well, maybe I have options to examine country of origin or the customs value. Maybe a bonded warehouse is appropriate.
I think we've lost Jody for a
Yeah.
moment. What about the other thing I hear a lot about are exemptions, and that
Yeah.
there's and that they keep changing day to day.
Uh,
Again,
I'll jump
Jody,
in on
sorry
this
you
one.
froze, so you
Yeah.
carry on.
Yeah.
Sorry
So,
about that.
early on, I think the administration and President Trump even was asked a question, I believe, in a press conference. He said there will be no exemptions, and and I think that's something that we sort of had to. They might have a difficult time accepting that there need to be exemptions, but I'm of the opinion, and we've had this conversation internally, that there will be exemptions. I think that there have to be in some very unique cases. I think there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes, especially as I mentioned, with Senate and House members who are both genuinely concerned for the well-being of industry in their states and in their districts, but also for political sensitivities, right, related to some of the things we talked about earlier regarding polling, et cetera. So there will be some exceptions. I also think that there are ways to make the case for, this is a quote unquote reciprocal tariff, and there's an opportunity for some sort of reciprocal exemption, right? In some industries, you might see some of that going on. Things that are a little bit more small business focused, right? If we put it that way, and some of that is already started. Those conversations are already being had with folks in the Trump administration, and now that there's a little bit more emphasis over at BIS around this issue, I think we're going to see some of that being put into place. The question is, will there be a framework around it, right? Is there going to be a process where you can let people know, hey, this is how you apply for an exemption? And I don't know if that's actually going to get put into place, which is why I think it's important for individuals to advocate either through this organization, the chamber, or other trade associations that you might be a member of, or directly with your elected representative, whether it's here or abroad, right? I think it's important for you to be vocal, let them know what it is that you're dealing with, and if you have trading partners, you can actually collaborate. I'll share a specific case we're working on in the food and beverage space. There's two small industry sectors that are very similar in the US and in Europe, and they've decided to form their own alliance, stood up a trade association. These are small and mid-sized businesses, but they sort of created this in the last 30 days, and they've had a lot of success on both sides, building that bridge and kind of positioning themselves with a very strong narrative around the benefit that they have downstream to small businesses, and why this can be very, very harmful in comparison to the offset of generating revenue from tariffs. The economic impact of this downstream could be far greater than whatever benefit they would get from the revenue they would generate from tariffs. That's one example, and we're talking about small and mid-sized businesses here, and I think they're going to they've positioned themselves, I think, to a place where they might be one of those groups that can get an exemption once that process starts.
Well, let's say you started as very optimistic. I like the idea of a process for exemptions, that we
Right.
had in the first Trump administration with the tariffs on products of China.
Yes.
And there were lots and lots of exemptions granted for companies that were importing components and manufacturing in the US, or products that just could not be sourced elsewhere. And there was US jobs at stake.
That's right.
So I would,
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you'll have something similar. It's interesting because there's a question here about, from Eric talking about how in 1998 President Trump gave an interview with Oprah Winfrey, talked about tariffs. Why are we surprised? I don't think this people are necessarily surprised. I think the surprise is the contrast between how it was handled in the first Trump administration and how it's been handled now. And Laura, you described a very consistent and familiar process, right, with public opinion periods and publishing of rules and talking to stakeholders and bringing an industry to the table and preparing people for what's to come so they can make sound commercial decisions, right, on supply chain, et cetera. This time around, and you were just talking about, some of the considerations that are currently in place. Once that comment period ends, it's coming into effect. And these IEPA powers that the president has, which Congress, I don't think is going to act to temper in any way. That's the only way that it can be changed, and I don't think they're going to do it. Give them that kind of authority, right, to do this immediately. And so I think that's what's surprising people is how quickly and chaotic the nature of what's taking place is here. Not so much the fact that he's so in favor of tariffs. And I think this is another example where last time there was order, there was a process, it was very straightforward. I'm not sure they'll be able to do that this time around, because a lot of folks who've come in have said, well, that should never have happened. We should never have done those exceptions. And so there's this internal debate that goes on as well around some of these issues.
Do all the executive orders that President Trump is signing have any impact on all this? What can he or can he not do by executive order?
I mean, I think like Jose just said, he's relying very frequently on IEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, where he has to show there's a national emergency. But he lays that out in his executive orders. He's built a case for a national emergency, whether really hasn't even used the border issue much. He's spoken a lot about fentanyl and then national security in his executive orders. So it's pretty broad. And as Jose said, I don't think Congress is going to temper him. I agree with that. There's already litigation with this, challenging the president's actions. Whether it will be successful, there's still litigation from the first time around, and it was done in a deliberative way. So,
yeah,
we'll see.
We have had another question come in. Do you expect fees on Chinese ships docking at the U.S. ports will become a reality, and what would be the impact of that, particularly in countries in the Caribbean?
I can speak to that briefly.
Yeah.
I do think they're going to go into effect. I think that's in process. The dollar impact per shipment, I haven't seen that yet. I mean, I think that has to be figured out, and it will impact different companies differently. But it will be an additional cost to importing into the US because a lot of ships are Chinese built or Chinese owned. I think the Trump administration has been very clear.
Okay. Well, I think, maybe we can sort of try to come back as we sort of wind down toward the end of our time and try to summarize some of what was a fairly technical and detailed discussion of some things, and maybe finish up with a little summary of kind of what we can expect, what are the key sort of strategies that can be employed, and what, as a practical matter, resources can you suggest that people reach out to as they try to navigate through this sort of very challenging time, and see if we can leave the group with just a quick summary of all this. Anybody want to start that?
Yeah. I mean, I'll go first and I'll be brief. It's, be vocal. That's the only thing I would say. And I know that doesn't solve the problem, but you got to let people know the pain that you're feeling. Sometimes, as business owners, and I myself was in the sort of food and beverage manufacturing space for a period of time and felt the pain of some of the tariffs from the last time around. And I'm sure this time my peers in the industry are feeling it even more. You got to let people know the pain that you're feeling. Reach out to your corresponding elected officials, make them aware, and look for organizations like the chamber and like other groups where you can be informed and then you can be a part of to advocate for good policy. It's a tough thing to do while you're dealing with your business being adversely affected and potentially not being able to meet your economic obligations, but you can't ignore it. I would encourage you to be vocal and make sure people are aware of what you're going through.
One of our guests has said in Europe, we're aware of the tariffs not being the end game. Are we looking at the right chessboard?
That's the big question with Europe. I think it's this is a whole nother conversation we could have, but there's a big realignment of the relationship that's taking place. And, on a broader basis too, I think the Trump administration has prioritized the Americas in a way that hadn't happened in more than 20 years for different reasons, right? Different national security priorities, global war and terror, other things that were going on around the world. But it seems that just the way that they came out of the gates on some of these issues, day one, the hemisphere or the Americas is going to be a big priority from a national security and foreign policy standpoint for the administration, while still keeping some of the historic relationships with Europe. But we've seen already some of the drawback on funding commitments, on other issues and conversations regarding NATO. So that's a whole nother topic, but that's definitely going to be a realignment of the transatlantic relationship.
I mean, circling back to, again, what companies could do to prepare again is know your supply chain and then speak with a trusted advisor to look at what options there might be if you're not able to do your own analysis, or even if you start to do an analysis and just need a sounding board. Something to note that we didn't touch on is there are technology solutions out there that people could use to really map their supply chain and even go back to their tier 2, tier 3 suppliers to see where they might be impacted if they're looking back to country of origin, right? There are so many solutions out there. I know everyone's panicked because there's so much going on, but there is a solution for everybody. Some might be more impactful than others, but there's definitely something that companies can deploy.
Laura, we're just about at time. Would you like to offer some final thoughts?
In 30 seconds, yes. I think that this is a time companies need to be aggressive in their import declarations, but compliant. Try to reduce the valuation of their goods, try to move components for complex products so that it's not country of origin China, but it's country of origin somewhere else that has a lower tariff rate.
Very good. Well, thank you to our very distinguished panel for taking the time to discuss this today. It is a very challenging, complex, and rapidly moving subject. Thank you to all the participants who joined us today. We appreciate it. And we undoubtedly will be doing more programs on this general subject as time goes on.
Yes,
Thank you, Emma.
absolutely. So many
You've been a great
thanks
moderator.
to Jody, Jose, and Laura for very insightful discussion, and of course to Alan, our moderator, for managing it. It's a confusing maze, so I thought that some of the tips and strategies were extremely helpful. And yes, we are in a period of realignment of the transatlantic relationship, and we look forward to somehow being a part of it. So before closing the event, please, for our audience, feel free to reach out to us at EACC Florida if you have any additional questions. And if your company is a member, we will do our best to answer it. Our next program will be held in person in Miami on May 8th, and it will offer an update on the EB-5 Investor Green Card program and President Trump's intent to replace it with a Gold Card visa program and more. So ESCC Floridas are part of something bigger, so if your company is not a member yet, find out how to join by reaching out to us. And for now, greetings from sunny Miami, and see you very soon. Thank you very much.